As the Obama presidency comes to an end, is the world better off today than it was 8 years ago? Joining us to discuss America's international standing is CCTV's Jessica Stone. He's the only president to serve both terms at war. And why wasn't he able to pull out the Middle East? How did he end up at war during his entire tenure? For that, we go to CCTV's Jessica Stone in the newsroom. It's been an eventful 8 years. How does it break it down for us?
Well, Nathan, the Obama administration would really say that they aren't at war in Afghanistan, that they've just left a training and equipping remnant there to help the Afghan security forces get back on their feet. Clearly, though, the Taliban have been more difficult to defeat there than the White House planned for, because now President Obama will leave office with 8,400 U.S. troops still in place rather than 5,500 he originally proposed. And that's roughly where the U.S. troop levels were a year after the September 11th attacks. Now, you think about in Iraq, there are now just a few thousand special forces on the ground helping direct strikes and conducting training operations. So a small presence there, that of course part of the counter-ISIL campaign. But under this U.S. president, drones have really largely replaced soldiers. Obama launching at least 500 drone strikes, killing thousands of alleged terrorists.
Obama, of course, Jessica, continues to build on his efforts regarding climate change, trans-Pacific trade, Iran's nuclear program, nuclear proliferation generally. As he comes to the end of his term, it's legacy time after all. Yes. Is he in jeopardy of losing ground since he took office?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to note that the White House really considers the China-U.S. relationship to be, quote, one of the most significant drivers of global action on climate in particular. In fact, there's a strong possibility we could see both countries ratify the Paris Climate Agreement during this upcoming G20 summit in Hangzhou. They also credit China with working closely to close the Iran nuclear deal. And of course, China, the second largest economy in the Asia-Pacific, on the trade side, hasn't been party to the major effort of the Obama administration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade talks. The TPP appears to be dead, as we've been talking about for weeks now here in the U.S. Congress won't vote on it, and both presidential candidates don't support it. It is clear that the White House plans to make one more really big pitch targeted at the domestic audience and the regional audience for TPP when Obama travels to Laos after the G20. Take a listen.
TPP is in many ways seen as a litmus test for whether or not the U.S. has staying power in this region. We are a Pacific power, and we have been traditionally, but we're also on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And what the countries of the Asia-Pacific region want to know, particularly the Asian countries, is whether or not we can be counted on.
So that's the message we can expect to hear from Obama next week after the G20 completes. That said, only 5 of the 12 members of TPP are actually in Asia, to his point. China, of course, negotiating a separate trade agreement with a broader number of Asian and Pacific nations, such as Australia, New Zealand, and India. And that agreement, of course, Nathan, is moving forward.
Jessica, what's been his biggest challenge, do you think, over the last 8 years? How's he likely to be remembered? Is there an Obama doctrine?
Plenty of challenges, certainly, and when you ask the president, he says his biggest mistake in these interviews that he's been giving as he gets closer to the end of his tenure is probably what happened in Libya, that he regrets the outcome there because it has become a sanctuary for ISIL and other terror groups. But remember how he began his foreign policy in many ways with a look towards Asia, this Asia pivot back in 2009, the president growing up in Hawaii and Indonesia. He really believes that the Asia-Pacific is most economically and politically it's a really economically and politically important part of the world. He tried to turn the U.S. attention towards it, but the foreign policy established and the real needs of the Middle East, whether it's the Syria refugee crisis, the Arab Spring, or ISIL, they all kept drawing him back in. So some are going to probably say that his Asia pivot wasn't successful.
Events always get in the way of policy, don't they? Thanks so much, Jessica Stone, from our newsroom. To continue the discussion, we are joined by Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean at California State University. Here in the studio in Washington, P.J. Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of State under President Obama and Professor at George Washington University, and author of the forthcoming book, Red Line, American foreign policy in a time of fractured politics and failing states. Also with us is Jim Jatras, a former US diplomat himself and foreign policy advisor to the Senate Republican leadership. Viewers can also join the discussion here by tweeting your thoughts and comments to CCTV_America. That's hashtag CCTV The Heat. Let's go to our panel. PJ, let's start with you. It is legacy time for Obama. And remember, he came into office 8 years ago, vowing to end 2 wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, closing Gitmo. But of course, all those events, the Arab Spring, Libya, Syria, ISIL, Russia, we could go on. If we're weighing up how he's done, would you give him a passing grade?
Of course.
Why?
I mean, Obama confronted arguably the most complex international environment since the end of World War II. And he largely delivered the foreign policy that he advertised in 2008. Now, did he have successes and failures? Yes. I would say one bookend is the Iran nuclear deal, and that was consistent with his objective of engaging America's adversaries and also, trying to wind down the existing wars without starting new ones. Obviously, the greatest complexity in his 8 years in office came, with the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings that turned America's foreign policy on its head, and that's something that not only has he struggled with over the past 5 years, it's going to bedevil next presidents for multiple terms.
Let's turn to Hamoud. Talking of the Arab Spring, it did seem to the outside observer that really the Obama administration were trying to react to events, despite what he laid down in his speech in Cairo in 2009. What sort of grade would you give him in reacting to those events in the Middle East as well? We talk about Libya and Syria as well. I know there's a lot.
There is a lot, and I think it's really a mixed bag. Definitely it will be around, I'm not that an easy grader, so I might give him a C+, a B-.
Oh dear.
Because the very fact that it is a very, very difficult situation, I think President Barack Obama has been able to work a thin line between the geostrategic the demand in the region, the changes in the region, and the American domestic politics. As we see, there is a fatigue among the American public that we really don't want any world war. 6,000 people killed, about 40,000 injured, and trillions of millions and billions of dollars spent on the war. So there is that sense that in taking decision, in observing his actions, he's been taking a very slow path, reactive, as you said, but in most of the time, given the situation, I think it's a mixed bag. It's really not an excellent performance.
Just a quick follow-up on that. What's his biggest failure in the Middle East, do you think, and what's his biggest success, if there is any?
I think the biggest success is his foreign policy towards Iran. I think that will bring some new changes in the future. I think his biggest failure is Syria, and not being able along those sides is also the policy towards Iraq, where things continues to be the same thing. And along with that is the fight against terrorism. But Syria is biggest. I think it will be seen as a biggest failure. There are so many areas in the Middle East that one could consider as failures. The flip-flop, if you want, on the Egyptian case, what's happening in Yemen, in Bahrain. All these are very, very serious actions. But the Syrian politics has dominated, I think, the scenes. And given the importance of Syria, that could be one of the most sort of glaring failures.
Jim, you're obviously on the Republican side. You've advised top Republicans on foreign policy. How would you judge the Obama administration's foreign policy?
I'd be tempted to give him an F-, except for the Iran deal. I'll take the minus off and just give him a plain F. Look, this is a guy who was elected to be the anti-Bush. Instead, he turned out to be Bush light, that instead of renditioning and torturing people, we just kill them with drones. He's got his own Iraq-style regime change operation in Libya. He's tried the same thing in Syria and made a hash of that country, supporting essentially terrorists for 5 years now. A regime change of a rather different sort in Ukraine. On the big picture, the most deadly thing to American security is to push Russia and China into a de facto alliance against us by not having adequate regard for the foreign policy and security priorities of those powers. I'd be tempted to say I don't see how it could get worse, except my fear that if his former Secretary of State gets elected, we will see how it gets worse when all of George Bush's neocon friends join that administration.
Well, the election and Hillary Clinton potential president foreign policy is another show. But judging with Obama, do you think he actually had a doctrine, or do you think he was reacting to events?
No, I think his goal has always been domestically. He wanted to transform America in a progressive direction, which he has largely succeeded in doing. I think he is, frankly, when it comes to foreign policy, he's an empty suit. He doesn't have much interest and knowledge in the matter. Remember, as a guy with no experience in this area, when he got, even less than Donald Trump, when he got elected. And I think he basically reads what's on his teleprompter, and when he gets himself up at the edge of the abyss, as he did in Syria in 2013, he looks into the abyss and says, oh my God, how did I get here? How do I get out of it? I think that's maybe his only saving grace in that regard.
PJ, successes?
I think...
Apart from the Iran deal, which...
Well, I would say the opening to Burma, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, is very significant.
Everyone calls it Myanmar now, by the way. Everyone is still calling it Myanmar.
And by the same token, I think it is fair to say that continuing the maturation of the U.S.-China relationship and the climate change deal is a major part of that. I was in Copenhagen in December 2011 when the President and the Secretary of State barged into a secret meeting. And from that point where China said, we're a developing country, this is not our problem, you guys created it, you guys fix it, China has evolved, and that came about through some very aggressive diplomacy by the Obama administration.
I just want to go back to Hamoud for 1 second. In terms of Syria, where do you think the president, the US president, could have done better, considering everyone knows that Syria is probably the most intractable conflict that we've had? Or do you think it became like that because of inaction by countries like the United States?
Well, I think the biggest challenge there is the fact that the conflict was sort of let go for a long time, longer than expected. Some would argue that he should have intervened back in 2013. He should not have renegated on his threat. But the idea is that you have United States allies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia. You have Turkey, a major ally. A solution should have been sort of come early to keep the integrity of the Syrian territory. For one of his reasons is the dysfunctioning of the whole Syria could be as bad as what we've seen in Iraq in the early 2003, 2005, or up to 2006. So the point is that staying too late, not taking action earlier, and being reactive in a sense, it was too little too late to intervene, where now we have the Russian involved, you have the Saudis fully involved in the issue, and then you have, of course, the latest development, or what has been always there, is the Turkish, the Turks, and so on and so forth. So the taking time, which is really one of the characteristics of this president, he takes his time to make these decisions. Sometimes it's in good way, and sometimes it produces different results. But either way, the failure to act earlier, sooner than later, perhaps complicated this situation.
I want to pick up with Syria, but we have to go to break. We've also got to talk about Russia. We've got to talk about the Asia pivot lots more. President Obama, of course, has advocated a world without nuclear weapons too, a more united international community, growth in developing countries. Has he achieved that vision? Tweet your comments and questions at CCTV-America, hashtag CCTV The Heat. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike.
Welcome back. We are discussing the foreign policy legacy of outgoing US President Barack Obama. Let's get back to our panel. PJ Crowley, your new book's going to be called Red Line. He was talking about a red line, the use of chemical weapons, but that strike never happened. Big failure of the Obama policy?
Well, I think that the Obama administration did achieve a notable success. The removal of most chemical weapons. Obviously, chlorine bombs have continued to be a challenge in Syria.
A last-minute deal with Moscow, yeah.
Yeah, but obviously the management of that process, did create international questions about the credibility of American power. So I think he did the right thing, perhaps not necessarily in the wrong way. I do want to say back to Hamid. I think that we talk about Syria as if it's one conflict. I think there are 10 sides to the Syrian conflict. I think the president's instincts about being measured about what the United States can do, I think is right. I think if the United States or the Obama administration, probably miscalculated, it was first they thought that Assad, would go the way of Gaddafi. Obviously, he's still there.
And most others in the region.
Yeah, and I think that we just have to recognize that this is going to be a generational struggle. If we want to criticize the Obama administration for not solving it in their, 5 or 6 years, this is going to be something that bedevils the next president and the president after that.
Jim, I want to bring you in. The red line, obviously, you think that was a turning point for allies and adversaries to look at the Obama presidency, but it was also a beginning of a sort of dance with Russia on the international stage as well, which still isn't quite over.
That's right, and the Russians have thrown us lifeline after lifeline when it comes to Syria, and we keep trying to game them, saying, okay, fine, but at the end of the day, Assad must go, which simply is not going to...
the conflict's not going to end unless he does.
No, quite to the contrary. The conflict will end when the terrorists are defeated.
I mean,
and because he's not going to go, and that's the whole point we have to start to accept. Look, let's remember what happened. As I say, Obama read from his teleprompter, red line, blah, blah, a line he should not have drawn. The British Parliament unexpectedly voted down their participation in this, and that is what then spurred on right, left, and center of the United States a huge outpouring of opposition to the Congress, and Obama was then smart enough to take it out, which is to say, well, let the Congress decide, and then Vladimir threw him a lifeline to say, let's get the weapons out of there. Suppose he'd followed through with his red line. At best, we'd see the kind of chaos we see in Libya, or more likely, we'd see the black flag of Daesh or Al-Qaeda or somebody flying over Damascus. Another job well done.
Well, there has been an accusation from Republicans that Obama has led from behind, and, and Russia features quite heavily in this.
That's right.
Is that, okay, it started with Libya, with the backing of the NATO campaign, but not essentially leading the NATO campaign. But we've seen, some people say, a backseat in Syria as well, and a tacit acknowledgement of Russian involvement.
That's right, and that's why I disagree with the, if you want to call it the mainstream of Republican opinion, which is essentially neoconservatism. It's Bush-era neoconservatism, that there is only one fault with American power, never using enough of it. And I think that's a mistake. The idea that we get to decide who should be the leaders of other countries, overthrow them at will, I think is bad strategically for the United States.
So tolerate, the U.S. should tolerate spheres of influence, for example, like Ukraine,
absolutely,
Crimea.
Absolutely. Spheres of influence are absolutely. Let's look at the most stable period of European politics in the 19th century under the concert of powers.
Concert of Europe,
there was a recognition that you don't step on other powers' toes gratuitously. We don't respect that anymore. We think our spear goes right up to the territorial waters of every other country in the world. That's a mistake.
Although the struggle for mastery in Europe did have quite a few localized wars, but we could, that's another
localized
show.
Wars, they happen.
Okay.
They do.
Hamoud, is there a power vacuum now in the Middle East being filled by powers other than the US, including Russia? And of course, China has growing economic clout and interests in the region as well. Are we seeing a step back, do you think, from the US's post-World War II globalized role with the Obama administration?
Well, there are those who would argue that there is not a setback, but it's change of strategy, a shift in type of engagement. Those who argue that Obama or President Obama is not engaged in the Middle East conflict say that because of the circumstances that emerged with the Arab Spring, that there is a sense that doing or trying to get a balance act between the American domestic fatigue and the geopolitical consideration or changes required for President Obama to take a different approach, which is relying on surrogates in the region, relying on Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, or non-state actors to achieve what amount to not a bigger threat to American national interests. So certainly with that approach, we have had a vacuum where we have the emergence of the Iranians as a regional power threatening the Gulf, or perceived to be a threat to the Gulf countries, particularly in Bahrain, particularly in Yemen. And Saudis are very concerned about that. You also have non-state actors, the Daesh organizations, who seems to be having some kind of influence in the region. So in many ways, the American presence is seen in different ways. The wars using drones, the idea that we should rely on surrogates in the region has also had its consequences because of a feeling that the region feels that the United States is not doing what is expected to be doing. And more than anything else, it continues to be seen as a problem, not a solution to the conflict. And more than anything else, today, when we rely heavily on the surrogates, like the Qataris, the Saudis, there is also a fearing that the United States may not be that dependable of an ally. So the vacuum is certainly there, and but it's also, we have to understand, we have to look at the geostrategic changes, and we have to look at it from that perspective. It's not that simple to judge President Obama on just the fact of what's happening.
PJ, Middle East obviously dominating a lot of Obama foreign policy, but it was meant to be a little bit different, wasn't it? The pivot, the rebalance to Asia was very much a centerpiece of the administration's policy. Did the Middle East sort of pull them away from that? Or do you think when it comes to the rebalance, they're pretty much on track? And
well, I mean, there is a pivot. It's ongoing. It's in its early stages. And it's going to be something that I think the next president is going to pick up one way or the other. I think the calculation of the administration was that we will pivot to Asia, and we were overinvested in the Middle East, and then again, the Middle East, as we've been talking about, has been pulling us back in. You know, I mean, as the only genuine global power, we can do more than one thing at the same time. So I think perhaps maybe it was a challenge of presentation, the idea that a pivot means we'll do less here, less there. You know, the answer is we're going to be significantly engaged in the Asia-Pacific region. We're dealing with a generational struggle, a transformation in the Middle East that's going to be going on for the next 50 years. And then, oh, by the way, you know, we just spent the last, you know, couple of years, you know, talking about the classic mission of NATO, Article 5. Yeah. And the reality is this is what you get in the White House. You're going to have to do meaningful work in all elements of the world at one point or another.
But can the U.S. do everything? I mean, and let's just focus on Asia, because the rebalance was meant to be diplomatic, militarily, and trade. And there has been a feeling in the region, rightly or wrongly, that perhaps they don't quite know allies of the U.S., how far the U.S. will come to back them up. There's also a feeling in Beijing, let's face it, sorry, just let me finish this point, that the pivot or the rebalance is basically a contained China policy.
That's certainly how China feels.
Well, that's an important, I mean, given the number two.
No, but actually, you know, if part of the rationale behind the pivot was for understandable reasons, that because, you know, the Bush administration was focused on the aftermath of 9/11, Afghanistan, and Iraq, you know, it had paid less attention to the Asia-Pacific region. You know, that was part of the purpose of the pivot, and I would argue that today, U.S. relations with its traditional allies in the region are strong and are going to get stronger. A lot of that has evolved around challenges in the South China Sea, you know, the East Sea, but you know, without taking sides on on the final resolution of various boundary disputes. The United States has been clear in saying that these should be resolved through international means, and while reinforcing the importance of freedom of navigation. And I think the United States' response to these flashpoints has really deepened the level of cooperation and support that the region feels from the United States.
Jim, what do you feel about the rebalance to Asia?
I think it's as misguided as the rest of Obama's policy.
Why?
Look, because it suffers from the same defect as we do not have a clear sense of what's in it for the United States. Do we have a dog in this fight? Let's take South China Sea. Let's take South China Sea. Which part of China do we not understand here? We say we have allies, interests to protect. You normally have allies to help you protect your interest. The only interest we have in the region is protecting our allies' interests. It's a complete self-licking ice cream cone. If there was a dispute we had in the Caribbean with Mexico or Cuba, whoever, do you think the Chinese would give a damn about what we did to secure our interests? No. They would say we don't have a dog in that fight. That should be our position in the South China Sea. I relate to something else that was said earlier about using surrogates. I sometimes feel that we're the surrogate. That, for example, take Saudi Arabia, who spends a lot of money in this town and peddles a lot of influence. Is there any group of terrorists in any regional conflict connected to Saudi Arabia and inspired by Wahhabism we haven't gotten into bed with? And I feel that with a lack of national interest-based foreign policy, we end up carrying other people's water for them.
Jim is a solid 19th century kind of guy. But
there is that feeling in this
I'm more of a 9th century kind of guy.
Sorry, we have to finish the show in a minute. But last point, but there is this feeling as we go out of the Obama administration that perhaps a little bit of isolationism, a little bit of stepping back, we see it with the rise of the man who will not be named on the show.
I call it realism. Realism is what I would call it.
But I mean, back to the question of interest. Look, the United States has fought multiple wars in Asia. It has an interest in peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. It has a security treaty, with Japan. Much of its economy is rooted in the Asia-Pacific region. Most of the history of the 21st century will be written in the Asia-Pacific region. So I disagree with Jim that we don't have an interest here, and we should let those who, and we are an Asia-Pacific country. So I think that clearly over 8 years, we have strengthened our engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. Our allies, our friends, welcome the attention that we've given to it, and we've seen meaningful results.
I wish we could go on further, and of course we didn't talk too much about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, which is the third leg of the stool, the economic negotiations, which of course are in peril now here in this town in Washington. Thanks so much for joining us. A great panel indeed. I wish we could have longer. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation, of course, does continue online. Join us on CCTV's America Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. Thanks so much for being with us.